Hello everybody, today we'll be talking about the cosmological argument for God's existence. Thomas Aquinas was a 13th century Catholic priest who lived from 1225 to 1274. Thomas Aquinas is famous as a source of major change in the Catholic Church, and most Catholics have probably heard of him. Aquinas produced 5 proofs of God's existence. These are proofs other than the ontological argument, which he found unconvincing, and therein lay a lesson. Aquinas agreed with the conclusion that God exists, but that was not enough for him to accept just any old argument which reached a conclusion that he liked. At any rate, the first 3 of these arguments, and arguably the 4th, are all really versions of the same argument known collectively as the cosmological argument for God's existence. This is still an argument that we hear in various forms today. We will be discussing the first 3 of these, as the 4th is more confusing and seems to have additional problems over the first 3. As for the 5th argument, this is known as the teleological argument for God's existence. We will be looking at that argument during the semester as well, but not Aquinas' version of it. Instead, we will look at Paley's version of it, which is stronger and more detailed. This module covers both the details of the cosmological argument and objections to it, and this coverage is split into 2 different lectures, the first to explain the theory and the second to explain these objections. So essentially, this is a lecture on one thing broken up into 2 parts. It is of course important therefore to remember the content of this first lecture when viewing the second, since it will pick up right where this one leaves off. So, what is a cosmological argument? Unlike the ontological argument, the cosmological argument is not an a priori argument. That is to say that we need to use the senses to get some data about the world to use as premises for our reasoning. The cosmological argument attempts to prove that God exists through some fact about cosmology, that is to say the nature of the universe. All versions of the cosmological argument attempt to show that natural attempts to explain this observed fact about the universe results in something called an infinite regress, which Aquinas argues is irrational. The argument concludes therefore that God is necessary to explain our observation, which might be motion, cause, or existence. Here is the basic structure of the cosmological argument. It can be broken up in various ways, but here is how I break it up for you. First, we have a premise. Premise 1, there is some fact about the world. Second, we notice that this fact, this thing observed about the world, needs to be explained by some rule, which gives us premise 2. Third, we note that applying this rule to explain the first observed thing leads to another event that needs the exact same kind of explanation. But the same thing would be true for any natural explanation of that event. These explanations therefore would go backwards forever, that is to say cause an infinite regress. 6 is the claim, another premise really, that an infinite regress is irrational, nonsensical, or a fallacy. In the 7th step, conclude that there must be an exception to a rule in premise 2. We finally conclude that this exception is what we call God. Number 1 and number 2 are purported facts about the world, the second being some rule explaining the first fact. Steps 3 through 6 argue that there is a regress and that such a regress is problematic. Steps 7 and 8 try to resolve this conflict and reach a conclusion. Since all versions of the cosmological argument rest on this notion of an infinite regress, it is important at this point to stop and explain exactly what an infinite regress is. An infinite regress is a causal chain in which each event or thing was caused by a previous event or thing requiring the same kind of causal explanation. If a chain of events has no beginning, then it is argued that it must go backwards an infinite number of steps. But that means that there must have been an infinite amount of time required to reach the present. This is because each causal step takes some finite amount of time. Any finite amount of time, no matter how short, multiplied by infinity is infinite. Thus, it is argued that if there were an infinite regress, we can never get to the point in time we are at now. So infinite regresses, it is concluded, must be irrational. This might have gone too fast, so I'm going to say a little bit more. To understand what an infinite regress is, imagine that you are standing at the domino in this image marked present. Imagine that you see a domino falling right in front of you, for example. Now imagine that when you look backwards to the cause of that domino falling, all you can see are other dominoes, each more recent domino apparently having been toppled by the one further back, and so on. As you observe, dominoes keep falling in the present. The domino you just saw fall, which now happened in the past, has pushed over a new domino, and you can see that new domino will push over yet another, and so forth. So what you are noticing here is not just motion, but its cause. Each domino that fell was caused to fall by a previous domino falling. So you can explain the domino that is falling now by a previous domino which fell. And you can explain the previous domino falling from a domino falling before that, and so on backwards in time. But now suppose that somebody tells you that there was no beginning to this chain, that the dominoes stretch back infinitely. Aquinas would argue that you now have a problem. Each domino falling requires some amount of time to fall, even if that is only a fraction of a second. Suppose that each domino falling takes 1/10 of a second. So if you look back 10 dominoes, you know that this happened a second ago. If you look back 100 dominoes, you know that this happened 10 seconds ago, and so forth. But if there were an infinite number of dominoes behind the one currently falling, each of which caused the next to fall, that would require an infinite amount of time to have passed in order to get to the point in time that you are at now. But it is impossible to cross over an infinite amount of time, so if that hypothesis is true, you can never reach the point in time called now. Therefore, that can't be the explanation. Aquinas would argue that it is reasonable to conclude that some domino was tipped over a finite amount of time in the past. Maybe this was 10 minutes ago, maybe it was 10 years ago, but it could not have been an infinite amount of time ago, otherwise you can never get to the point in time that you are at now. We will in the next lecture discuss whether or not an infinite regress is really irrational, but there you have the basic idea, this idea that causes cannot go back infinitely. Okay, now that we know what an infinite regress is, we could look at Aquinas' first version of the cosmological argument, the prime mover or unmoved mover argument. He actually gets this argument in modified form from Aristotle, though it is important to note that Aristotle did not himself conclude that God exists from this argument, which will also hint at another objection that we will cover next time. Here is how it goes. Remember the basic structure of the cosmological argument. First, there is some fact about the world. In this case, it is that we notice that there are objects that are in motion. So suppose that we try to explain the motion of one of these objects. Premise 2. We notice that this fact needs to be explained by some rule. In this case, that any moving object must have been set into motion by some other moving object. Now we note that this means that the motion that we are trying to explain can only be explained by a previously moving object. But that previously moving object, the one used to explain the current bit of motion, would have to also be explained by the movement of another object, and so on forever backwards in time. This is an infinite regress. Then we have the premise that infinite regresses are impossible or irrational. We then reach the first conclusion that therefore there must have been an exception to this rule, in this case that there was a mover that was not caused to move by a previously moving thing, an unmoved mover. And finally, conclusion 2, that this first mover or unmoved mover is God. The first cause argument is very similar. First, there is some fact X about the world. In this case, it is that we notice some objects exist in some particular states. Next, we notice that this existence needs to be explained by another fact. Maybe you look at an orange hanging from an orange tree in your front yard. That orange was caused to exist by the processes of the orange tree. But the orange tree also needed a cause. Maybe it was planted from a pot brought at Home Depot 12 years ago, but that also required a cause. Maybe that potted plant was originally grown in a nursery 100 miles away. But the causes don't stop there. That seedling came from another orange, which came from another orange tree, which grew somewhere else, and so on. This isn't an issue with living things only. One might talk about how your chair was caused to be, for example. This gives us the rule that any existing thing needs to be caused by some prior thing. Our current existing thing can only therefore be explained by some previous cause. But each previous cause needs an explanation that can only come through another prior cause. But this kind of explanation would go back forever. Then we have the premise that an infinite regress is impossible or irrational. Next comes our pair of conclusions. First, there must be an exception to our rule, that is premise 2. There must have been a cause that was not caused by a previous cause. Then the final conclusion, that first cause or uncaused cause is God. In some ways, you can look at this as a broader version of the prime mover argument, since motion is just one type of cause. The third version of the cosmological argument that we will be looking at is the argument from possible and necessary existence. This one is a bit more difficult to understand. First, we will need to understand some terminology. A possibly existent thing, or something that is contingently existent, is the kind of thing you are familiar with, anything that possibly might not exist. This includes anything that didn't always exist, because anything that didn't always exist can clearly possibly not exist, since at one time it did not exist. A being with necessary existence would be something that must exist. The ontological argument, for example, tried to argue that God was a necessary being. Aquinas rejects the ontological argument for God's existence, but this version of the cosmological argument makes use of the concept of a necessary being. Here is the argument. For premise 1, we have our observed fact. Objects exist. Now, any object we might pick had only possible or contingent existence. That is to say, all objects can only be brought into existence by objects which previously existed and did not always exist. For example, maybe you have a cat. This cat exists, but it doesn't necessarily exist. It was brought into existence through the mating of its parents. It conceivably could not exist, and indeed, at one point in time, it did not exist, and it eventually will not exist again. But its parents, Mama and Daddy Cat, are in the same boat. They both exist contingently as well. Note that this isn't an evolutionary question. We can go back and say eventually that there was some cat-like ancestor, but that cat-like ancestor needed to come into being as well. It also doesn't only deal with living things. We could talk about a glacier that exists, but it doesn't necessarily exist. Maybe it came into being by falling precipitation. That precipitation didn't necessarily exist. It was caused through evaporation of water off the oceans, and so forth. So we end up with the rule. Every contingent being was caused by some other contingently existing thing or things. So our cat might be explained by its parents, but the cat's parents would also need to be explained in a similar way, and so forth backwards forever. What is more, since we are talking about contingent beings, it is possible that any of these might not have existed, compounded backwards forever, and if any one of them did not exist, then the present case would not exist. This is an infinite regress. Finally, we have our dual conclusions. First, that there must be an exception to our rule in premise 2, a being which necessarily exists. And second, that this necessary being is God. So Aquinas comes to the idea that God must have necessary being, but not in any a priori way, such as with the ontological argument. We need our senses to deduce this. This ends the explanation portion of the lecture. As noted, I am not going to talk about the fourth version of the cosmological argument here, but is discussed briefly in a video that I will link to, for as long as it is available, in the summary section of the module. At this point, you should be analyzing these arguments for yourself to consider how strong they are. In the next lecture, which is also part of this module, we will discuss the problems facing the cosmological argument. Until next time.